Good evening and welcome to a special installment of The Other Day about the year 2001. Another year of the current era has come to pass, and once again we're presenting events, people and phenomena that defined a lifestyle. Things that you wouldn't be able to imagine us without, much less understand. In 2001, Milosevich was extradited, kids were raving over Harry Potter, Kursk was recovered, anti-globalists became a thing, Raduyev was prosecuted, 9/11 and Bin Laden, anthrax, the war on terror, the 13% income tax, Tsar Simeon won the election in Bulgaria, the foot and mouth epidemic, the scooter fashion trend makes it to our shores. The Harry Potter book series followed a boy's transformation from a nerd into a powerful magician. At the prestigious Hogwarts School of Sorcery in England, he was learning how to make potions, fly broomsticks, and practicing waving his magic wand. At that point, Harry Potter was still learning magic, with Joanne Rowling having written just 4 books, and with 3 more to come, by the total number of grades at his school. The Gutenberg era received a new lease on life, with Harry Potter having torn kids away from their computers, instead making them read their favorite book under the sheets with a flashlight, just like their parents used to way back. What's the name of the alley where you can buy all of the supplies necessary for studying at Hogwarts? It's called Diagon Alley. And what exactly do the school's pupils buy there? Magic wands and hats. On May 7th, 2001, 1 year after Putin's inauguration, a new youth activist group called Walking Together was demonstrating organized admiration for the president right under his windows, at the St. Basil descent next to the Red Square. Young boys and girls were wearing t-shirts depicting Putin, stylized to resemble Che Guevara, and bearing the motto, "It's all good." Walking Together immediately received a bunch of nicknames, the least vulgar of which was Putin Jugend. Vladimir Putin is a man who is working towards lifting Russia up from its knees. The group's leader, Vasily Yakimenko, insisted that the walkers were in no way dependent on the Kremlin. They simply enjoyed walking together, while educating their peers. So you find 5 Detzel fans, and make them read Anna Karenina. How you do that is entirely up to you. Then you make them go to Suzdal, and make sure they attend another Rachmaninov concert. Young fans of Putin solemnly swore to their comrades to never smoke, drink, or use curse words, and to respect their elders. The idea was that 40,000 high school and college students decided they want to walk together. In early 2001, there were plenty of cold areas on Russia's map. Ulyanovsk, Arkhangelsk, the Kamchatka, but all of those were topped by Primoria, where 90,000 people were sitting at home with no heat in -30-degree weather. Emergency Situations Minister Shoigu flew in twice to help. The cold weather in Primoria was officially declared an emergency. Boiler plants and heating utilities were inactive, water pipes were exploding. Head of RAO USC Chubais and Primoria Governor Nazdratenko were blaming each other for the crisis. A state of crisis demands decisive action be taken. To me, this just looks like an absolute insult to those living in the region. The president decided that both were to blame, though Chubais got off with a warning, while Nazdratenko resigned as governor and became the head of the fishing industry committee. The crisis wasn't resolved until July, when an early election was held that nearly ended in failure, with only 30% of voters participating, of which 33% voted against everyone. This was a record-setting protest vote by Russian standards. Boris Koltsov reporting from Primoria. Some polling stations in the regional capital saw stacks of ballots with people voting against all that were much taller than the rest. By midnight, the difference between the first and second place candidates was only a few percent. The fact that almost a good third of the people decided to cast their votes against all quite obviously spoiled the mood for the winner Sergei Darkin's campaign staff. As for potential lawsuits, the winner's team is prepared to deal with them. I think the will of the voters has been quite clearly expressed, and I do think it will be honored. by all levels of government. In 2001, the lead pilot for Scuderia Ferrari, Michael Schumacher, becomes the best race car driver of all time. He set a new record for Formula One Grand Prix victories at 53. What makes a race car driver great? We've invited a TV personality and racer onto the show for him to share his exclusive commentary on the matter. Please welcome Nikolai Fomenko. Motorsports is pretty much all about pedal to the metal, and let's see what happens. They examined Michael Schumacher's retinas, and they worked out that there's a lens in there that's somehow angled differently. And apparently he's able to scan the track differently when he's in a moving car. I'd say he processes it faster. This is a guy whose official yearly salary is $50 million. He lives in Switzerland, but he shops for groceries in Germany because they're cheaper there. Meanwhile, he pays bonuses to the supporting staff at Ferrari out of his own pocket, which is something that he is not obligated to do. In my opinion, he's blessed by God himself, and that's the only thing keeping him alive. Because some of the things he does out on the track quite literally defy the laws of physics. There are plenty of rich people in the world, but among them there can't be any more than a couple of hundred race car drivers. Tank Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Budanov was charged with kidnapping, raping and murdering a Chechen girl named Elza Kungaeva. The whole country was paying close attention to this case in 2001, it being the first time a lawsuit filed by the Chechen people against the Russian army actually made it to court. In March of 2000, Budanov and a group of soldiers barged into the Kungaev household in Tangi village, taking 18-year-old Elza away against her will. Her parents weren't home at the time. One day later, locals found her dead body. And though the forensic report mentioned injured genitalia, the rape charges were dropped. Budanov was looking at up to 20 years for murder and abuse of power. Leave me alone, please. Thanks a lot for your support. They've got it all wrong. Please don't make things worse. Medical experts considered the murder a crime of passion, the maximum punishment for that being 5 years. Having suffered 4 contusions, Budanov was no longer fit for service, meaning he couldn't be charged for abuse of power. Starting in 2001, Russia had the lowest income tax rate in all of Europe, at 13%. The only other country with that sort of rate was Bolivia. Russia now had a flat tax rate that didn't vary depending on one's income. Time to come out from the shadows. Time to start paying taxes. Ministry of Tax and Revenue of the Russian Federation. The idea behind such a low tax rate was to bring salaries into the legal space. Up until then, they'd typically be given out in envelopes, the so-called black cash or grey deposit. It was easier and less risky to just pay the 13% tax than to try dodging it. A point that throughout the year was being driven home in TV commercials. In 2001, income tax revenue increased by 50% over the previous year. It's just 13%. It's very reasonable. In the summer of 2001, for a good 9 days, the country was waiting for a train to arrive that was transporting the dearest leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, to Moscow. Only twice along the way did he step off from his Eastern Express. Kim Jong-il's train consisted of 15 armored cars with tinted windows. One of the main goals of his visit was to discuss connecting the Trans-Siberian and Trans-Korean railroads. Kim Jong-il became the first national leader to place a wreath next to the mausoleum since the downfall of communism. At the Kremlin, the Korean leader confirmed that until 2003, his country would not launch a single ballistic missile. Goodbye, goodbye. Bye, bye. The return trip took him down the same route, and he was enraging Russian commoners the entire way, with suburban and long-distance trains either being delayed or cancelled. We've been living at the station for 2 days now. Our things are in the cloakroom, everybody is waiting, getting all nervous. A mechanic from Perm called Nazarov sued the Ministry of Transportation, demanding they compensate him 13,000 rubles. His family vacation was ruined because their train was late. In 1996 it was mad cow disease, and in 2001 there was a new blight on European livestock, foot and mouth disease. And once again, the epidemic originated in the United Kingdom. Foot and mouth affected cows, pigs, and even the sacred cows of Britain, as in sheep. The total number of infected animals that had to be put down in the UK was 3 million. In France, Germany, and the Netherlands, hundreds of thousands of carcasses had to be burned. Export of beef from Europe saw a 90% decrease. Pork export declined by 70%. Livestock farming, Britain's most highly subsidized industry, was essentially killed. Meanwhile, meat processing plants in Russia were switching to local livestock en masse. In 2001, Russia was witnessing a new phase in party engineering, when the foundations were laid for a three-party political system, which consisted of the main central bloc and the adjacent left and right wings. The decision is unanimous. According to the new law, an organization had to have at least 10,000 active members in at least half of Russia's regions to call itself a party. Major political capital was merging throughout the entire year. After Shoigu's Unity and Luzhkov's Fatherland became one, some joked that the new party would be called UNFAT and have a bear wearing a cap as its logo. During the Unification Congress, they also accepted Shaimiev's All Russia. Their new logo depicted Unity's bear, and Unity's Sergei Shoigu became the top dog among the big three. We'll be together during the next election cycle. The liberals, led by Gaidar, Kirienko, Nemtsov, Chubais, and Kakamada, came together to form the Union of Right Forces. Boris Nemtsov was elected to be their leader. Not all decent folks live in St. Petersburg. The left was represented by the same old Communist Party that deemed itself the only real opposition, though they were no longer accusing the current regime of working against the people. A membership card renewal campaign revealed that there were 500,000 active communists. Russia's new political troika bird now consisted of a core and 2 sidekicks, and raw material suppliers. Starting in 2001, they began making special road markings for scooters in the West. This new metropolitan fashion trend then made it to our shores, superseding the previous skateboard and rollerblade trends. The novelty item of that year, motorized scooters, turned sporting equipment into a means of getting around town during rush hour. In Europe, the US, and Japan, they were used by clerks and mailmen to get to and move around the office, while in Russia, the older folks reminisced about their childhood scooters, made using 2 planks and a couple of bearings instead of wheels. Modern scooters were being used by kids and teenagers to show off their mad riding skills. The number of Muslim suicidal martyrs was growing rapidly even before the terrorist acts of the millennium. Like the word kamikaze before, the word shahid, meaning a terrorist who would sacrifice his own life to destroy the enemy, was now universally understood without the need for translation, and they were Palestine's main weapon against Israel. In October, the 100th suicide bombing since the signing of a peace treaty in 1993 was treated like a holiday. As a matter of fact, almost half of those bombings actually happened in 2001. A young Arab would tie explosives to himself and detonate them in a crowded area. Nobody knew where or when they would strike next. 26 people were killed in an explosion at a discotheque in Tel Aviv. Most of them were former Soviet citizens. In August, a living bomb killed 16 people in a Sbarro pizzeria in Jerusalem. Shahids saw this as a heroic and honorable death, believing that they and all of their relatives would go to heaven. Raed al-Barghouti blew himself up on the Jerusalem Street of the Prophets. Sergei Kalashevsky with a report from his home in a village near Ramallah. Raed's mother showed us around their old house. The family has yet to move into the new house, where they currently have guests over. On the day of filming, they were being visited exclusively by women. They came to congratulate the parents. Are you proud of your son? Of course I am. To everyone who comes to our house, I say, if you bring joy, welcome. But if you bring grief, you're better off leaving. As soon as they learned about the Jerusalem bombing back in Ramallah, they hung portraits of Raed all around town. The mullah at the local mosque spoke of him like of a hero. The bomber had a bride waiting for him in his native village, whose name is Amani. I praise Allah that I still deeply love him. He gave his life for his country. What do your girlfriends think about your fiancé dying in such a way? They were all congratulating me. September 11th, 2001. The end of the world and the start of World War III were being broadcast live. The US, having never fought the enemy on its own turf, was hit right in the heart. New York and DC were attacked, and even the almighty special services were unable to stop it. After multiple cinema depictions of Armageddon, it was hard to believe that the actual apocalypse took place once upon a time in America.
Second jetliner heads for what even to the untrained eye looks like a surgical strike into the South Tower. Against the backdrop
actually just the pitch of the South Tower.
There were several
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
Unprecedented act of aggression by international terrorism. The financial elite, the best bank managers in the world, were buried under the World Trade Center's rubble. They made half of the world's population jealous, and the other half despised them. They weren't doing any heavy lifting, only reaping the world's richest harvest while putting themselves above all others. Western civilization's enemy number one was now Osama bin Laden. Right here I have a Halloween mask made in his likeness. As for his actual head, they put a bounty on it, to the tune of $25 million. You can say that terrorists have no creed or nationality all you want, but this was still very much a war of the worlds. All suicide bombers on the planet were Muslim. Naturally, people began to refer to it as Islamic terrorism. It wasn't long before they picked up bioweapons and began to send white death around in envelopes. Letters containing spores of anthrax were driving the US insane. Ken Alibek, a former Soviet bioweapon engineer who fled to the US, would often speak at special congressional hearings. Alexei Pivovarov with a special report from Alibek's lab near DC. We have entered the age of terrorism. And this won't be just ordinary terror like in the 20th century. The new methods are going to be something we've never seen before. Alibek complains that the US is not prepared to counter such terrorism, and that the rules need to be rewritten. But since democracy won't allow it, in the meantime, he recommends a certain old-fashioned method. You put the envelope onto an ironing board, lay a damp rag over it, dial the temperature up, and iron it for 1 minute. That'll make the letter safe to open. But that is obviously a temporary measure. You're not gonna iron letters for decades more to come. Alibek reckons the system needs to be overhauled, that every post office needs to have a gamma ray machine of the type they use to sterilize needles. The US has enough money to implement them in just a few years. And though you can't imagine seeing one in a Russian village, Alibek insists that they won't have a choice. On September 17th, US President George W. Bush announced the start of a crusade to fight pure evil. The international anti-terrorist effort was joined by each and every progressive country, and Russia was at the forefront. Meanwhile, in the States, patriotism was on the rise. Star-spangled banners were sold out. Big ones were hanging from every house. Smaller flags such as this one could be seen on every car and in every hand. Islamic extremists responded by declaring jihad, a holy war against infidels. This is the sort of ribbon worn by warriors of Allah. The writing says Allah is the only God and Muhammad is his prophet. On October 7th, US troops entered Afghanistan, where the Taliban, who instigated this wave of Islamic terror, were hiding Osama bin Laden. The first night of the retaliation was broadcast live. Flashes in the green of the Islamic sky, George Bush on CNN, and here's bin Laden on Al Jazeera, the Arab CNN. They've declared a war on Islam. They've come not for us, but for Islam. After a series of airstrikes, the US employed a third party to do the dirty work, the Northern Alliance, to whom the Taliban were also enemies. After Kabul was taken, our planes became the first to land there. Russia brought humanitarian aid and promptly opened an embassy. Then Vladimir Putin broke through into the West. With his speech in German at the Bundestag in Berlin, and his trip to the US where he visited Bush's own ranch, turning Russia's president into one of the Western coalition's leaders. Bush remarked that he would have loved to be in the trenches with Putin. Starring Tom Hanks. Congratulations, how do you feel?
I gotta pee.
I believe he said he has to go pee. In 2001, Alexander Solzhenitsyn released volume 1 of his study titled 200 Years Together. As it says in the foreword, prompted by the historical material and hoping to find benevolent solutions for the future, Solzhenitsyn addressed one of the most painful Russian issues pertaining to Jews. The 82-year-old documentary book writer presented that year's bestseller, with 3 editions of it published in a row. Behind the cheerful anniversary title, you had accounts of how Russian Tsars treated Jews, Pales of Settlement and other measures, Jew-bashing, about the role Jews played in commerce and the service sector, and their participation in the revolutionary movement. Volume 1 covered the years from Catherine the Great all the way to October. Solzhenitsyn wasn't calling to bash or save them, to be proud or to repent, but he still upset folks from both sides of the aisle, who were calling him both Solzhenitsyn the Kaik and Russia's main ideologue of anti-Semitism. Russian television adopts a new genre, reality game shows or simply reality TV. Russia's Last Hero and Behind Glass were adaptations of foreign shows called Survivor and Big Brother, respectively, where ordinary folks were living in tight spaces while being filmed 24/7. The TV was now a keyhole and an aquarium that had actual people in it. Behind Glass was shot in the Russia Hotel right next to the Kremlin, where they built an apartment in the hallway that for 1 month became home for 3 guys and 3 girls. Can he maybe get up and go shoot himself? What do you think? The viewers were the ones to choose 2 winners who would win an actual apartment. The roommates by chance, Margot and Max, Dennis and Olga, formed bonds that the viewers were treating like soap opera romance. Don't forget that they're going to be showing this on TV. The program's many fans would come to have a peek through the window, while critics on the internet explained that looking into that nasty apartment is actually a low thing to do. Last Hero was a survival game, where 2 teams consisting of Russian and Ukrainian citizens located on 2 uninhabited Caribbean islands had to look for food and shelter. Once a week there would be a sacrifice, as in one person would have to leave, up until the last hero was left standing. I honestly said that I won't be easy on them. This was an even more popular reality show. It's more fun to watch animals when they're struggling and roaming around, as opposed to just sitting behind glass. First time eating a snake. And how is it? Tastes like shit. On October 4th, 2001, a Tu-154 airplane belonging to Siberia Airlines, en route from Tel Aviv to Novosibirsk, fell into the Black Sea. 77 people were killed. The attack on New York happened less than a month prior, and so people immediately thought this was a terrorist act. But then proof came out that the plane was hit by a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile that was launched during a training exercise in the Crimea. The Ukraine denied all allegations. The radar locked onto the target. The Ukrainian president and military maintained that the rocket didn't have enough range, and that they recorded every flight path. I think that's enough. This has to end. They found holes from shrapnel in the wreckage, and later the shrapnel itself, which is the primary payload of an S-200 missile. Realizing he can no longer keep up the denial, President Kuchma, who used to run a missile factory, made a completely outrageous statement. This is not the first and won't be the last time. Stop treating this like such a tragedy. Mistakes happen. The Ukraine was sued for $10 million to compensate for the lost lives and the downed aircraft.
In
2001 was a year of recovery for Russia. The recovery of Kursk, in keeping with the president's word. In the spring, a deal was signed with a Dutch company called Mammoth. In the summer, they got the submarine ready. And on the night from October 7th to the 8th, the sunken sub was lifted from the bottom of the sea. Here's a piece of the hull from a submarine of the same class as Kursk. And it is really heavy. The deformation of such metal could potentially give insight into what caused the catastrophe. For many months, the country was tuning in to news from beneath the water that spoke of 26 specially made orifices, a cable saw and a guiding harness. An enormous barge then dragged the submarine to the Roslyakovo docks. Prosecutor General Ustinov was on the scene. Here's what he had to say. Our experts assume that the entire submarine was filled with water after about 6 to 7 hours. The bodies of 79 seamen were extracted from the wreckage. There were funerals all around Russia. The president read the preliminary investigation report and fired 14 top-ranking officers of the Northern Fleet. The evidence of a collision with a foreign vessel was seen as circumstantial, and Section 1, that was of the most value to the investigation, wasn't due to be recovered until the following year. Alexei Veselovsky on the signs of life and death discovered on Kursk. Section 7 is the turbine room. 9 crew members under the command of Dmitry Kolesnikov. On one of the dividers, you can still see documentation for the ballast system approved by him. The water didn't damage the paper. There's a signature and a date, August 10th, 2000, which is when the training exercise began. Section 7 sustained relatively mild damage, with the baffle in Sector 6, the reactor room, taking the brunt of the shockwave. Even the daytime lights in certain places are still intact. The breathing masks are unused. They just couldn't get to them in time. And the emergency air supply systems might have been knocked out almost immediately. The devices for blocking off breaches are also in place. Captain Lieutenant Kolesnikov led all of his men from here into Section 9, the survival compartment. One less world was now floating in the cosmos. On March 23, 2001, the Russian Mir space station, after spending 15 years in orbit instead of the projected 5, was no more. It was still in good enough shape to operate, but couldn't due to a lack of funding. And so the station, together with $90 million worth of equipment, was destroyed. Mission Control guided Mir into the dense layers of the atmosphere where it burned up. Debris from the station fell right into a predetermined quadrant of the Pacific Ocean. The Russian Space Agency couldn't find anyone to sponsor keeping Mir in orbit, while the Russian government was allocating all of its funding to its share in the new International Space Station. That's where they had to take American space tourist Dennis Tito, who had already paid the country $20 million for the trip. I do think this trip will be of benefit, especially for us. American astronauts disapproved of an amateur flying to space, which prompted our crew members to revolt, with them refusing to make the trip. In the end, Dennis Tito did fly into space, under the condition that he wouldn't step foot on the American half of the station. As for the American gentlemen, they were always at least 330 feet away from me. The 61-year-old Tito was absolutely ecstatic upon returning to Earth, claiming he had been to heaven no less. Next up was a rich amateur tourist from South Africa. Today, the last fruit fly perished. For the first time since the start of the war in Chechnya, the opposing sides were holding negotiations. The first to call for them was right-wing leader Nemtsov, who was told by the president to either convince the rebels to lay down their weapons within a month or to vacate his chair in parliament. Later on, Putin himself was advocating for peace, albeit in the form of an ultimatum, urging the rebels to put down their weapons within 3 days. That ultimatum had no direct repercussions, aside from it revealing that support for the ever more pointless war was dwindling. The war is never going to end. They murder with total impunity, and then those same people seek revenge. As for indirect consequences, Putin's ambassador Kazantsev had a meeting with Zakayev, who was representing Maskadov. Their negotiations, referred to as just a meeting, made Russia look more civilized, especially since the international community had lost sympathy for Ichkeria after the 9/11 attacks, having admitted the Chechens' ties to international terrorist groups. I failed to notice any decisive action on their part. Russian terrorist number 2 Salman Raduyev was on trial in Makhachkala. Nicknames including Dudayev's son-in-law, Titanic, The Terminator, and Michael Jackson. For the first time in 40 years, the country's prosecutor general was acting as the prosecutor. No hard feelings towards the rebels, I hope? Wouldn't want you going home and trash-talking Chechens like we're all terrorists. Salman Raduyev starred in a bunch of interviews and news reports, and here he was having another moment. No matter what decision the court makes, God will issue his own verdict. The attacks on Kyzylyar and Pervomaisky were at the top of his list of offenses. The indictment was 500 pages long and took 2 days to read. Raduyev denied all allegations of forming combat units, taking hostages, and terrorism. There was no death penalty in Russia at the time, and so Raduyev was sentenced to life in prison. These proceedings show that Russia is capable of fighting terrorism not just with brute force, but also using the power of law. Anatoly Kulikov and Vladimir Barsukov, the 2 men who spearheaded the siege of Pervomaisky, which was Russian Special Services' most embarrassing operation ever, where shots were fired at hostages and Raduyev's unit got away. They were merely witnesses at the trial. They got off with no charges and gave no testimony. The 3rd International Theater Olympiad was held in Moscow in 2001, and Moscow hosted it with aplomb, setting up a stage on one of its central squares, making a lake on another one, and even removing the trolleybus wires on its main Tverskaya street. Moscow and its guests were treated to a 2-month-long theater marathon. The motto of the Olympiad was Theater for All. A highlight was Harlequin, or The Servant of Two Masters, directed by Giorgio Streller, named the best play of the 20th century. Others included a 5-hour rendition of Othello by Eimuntas Nekrošius, Bob Wilson's picturesque A Dream Play, and Zingaro's Horse Theater shown in Kolomenskoye Park. The Olympiad ended with clowns invited by Vyacheslav Palunin launching a boat of fools. All year, a massive transfer of power in the media sphere was at the forefront of the public's attention. New management was instated at stations like NTV, TV6, Moskovia, 7 Days Publishing House, Echo of Moscow Radio, and the Independent newspaper. And of course, all of this was accompanied by loud debates about private property rights and freedom of speech. After Media Most failed to reimburse a multi-million-dollar debt, Gazprom acquired a controlling stake in NTV. The shareholders had a meeting where they elected a new CEO, Boris Yordan. The former CEO, Yevgeny Kiselyov, objected to the decision, garnering support from his colleagues and calling those who sympathized to protest. NTV was broadcasting its own crossed-out logo and its office corridors. The new management prompted many employees who were very displeased with the takeover to bail. Kiselyov accepted an offer from Boris Berezovsky to become the head of TV6 and took the entire NTV Minsk team over there with him. Those fleeing employees were damning the usurpers on their way out. Then a dispute between managing structures led to a court ordering TV6 to be disbanded. The folks representing TTC, they violated protocol. The state-owned Moskovia TV station was taken over by a private party. The former Moscow province Megaphone also traded hands, and not without controversy. As for Echo of Moscow, Gazprom went and acquired most of its stock. The former Media Most newspaper today was shut down by its new owners, while Itogi magazine had to recruit all new staff. Ex-editor-in-chief of independent newspaper Vitaly Trechikov, who was fired by Berezovsky, filed to register 9 new outlets. Journalism in Russia was in a state of crisis, with TV channels and publications collectively advocating for themselves. Russian people were sticking close to lakes and rivers in order to survive the hot summer of 2001, and not everybody could, with 150 people drowning every single day. The highest death toll was being registered in Moscow. That year, the water took 328 lives in and around Moscow, which was 3 times higher than the previous year. Medical personnel were on duty at beaches, but most accidents were occurring where swimming was prohibited, where there was no supervision. And it was mostly beer that was killing people, not water. 70% of those who drowned went under while under the influence. The Water Rescue Society suggested banning sale of alcohol at the beach, while calling citizens to choose between drinking and swimming. I'm not gonna swim too far. I'll just take a little dip. You know? In 1999, NATO was bombing Yugoslavia and demanding they extradite a war criminal, the country's president Slobodan Milosevich. And 2 years later, they got what they wanted. Despite the country's law prohibiting extradition of nationals, and despite the new president Vojislav Koštunica's campaign promise, on June 28, 2001, Milosevich, who was already under investigation, was transferred from a prison in Belgrade to one in The Hague. It was the United States that insisted Milosevich be court-martialed as a condition for providing financial aid to the ravaged Yugoslavia. People hit the streets in protest, as they were intending to bring him up on corruption charges. Instead, he was going to be prosecuted by the West for his crimes against Albanians in Kosovo. This is a false indictment. These charges were pressed against me during NATO's aggression against Yugoslavia, when I was defending my country. Milosevich maintained that the trial was illegal, referring to his extradition as a kidnapping. The prosecutor accused him of ethnic cleansing in Croatia and Bosnia. And the West was in no rush to fulfill its end of the deal. Serbian Prime Minister Djindjic was furious with their treacherous Western partners for withholding the loans they promised. For the first time in English history, the Labourists became the ruling party for a second term in a row. They won the parliamentary election, meaning that Tony Blair would be the UK's Prime Minister for another 5 years. Being famously conservative, he kept speaking of a new England, while pointing out that he's of the rock and roll generation. As in the Beatles, Colour TV, that's the generation I come from. Prior to the election, they were selling chocolates shaped like the heads of party leaders, with Blair on a stick being the bestseller. We tried a bit before the show. It's too sweet, but that's the taste of victory. England, with its official name Great Britain already denoting grandeur, made the following official announcement through its Prime Minister over the radio. Our goal is to make Britain not the most powerful country, but the country with the most pleasant and comfortable living conditions. A mandate for reform for prosperity in the future. The country had become more of a constitutional monarchy, while seeing a record decline in unemployment and inflation, the abolishment of hereditary succession, as well as Scotland and Wales growing their autonomy. When Lady Diana died and nobody had anything to say, it was the Prime Minister who famously called her the People's Princess, with total disregard for what the Queen might think.
More than you will ever know.
Blair, the youngest leader in the Western world, even had a child during his first term, who was their fourth with Sherry Blair. On July 16th, at a cyber safety convention in Las Vegas, the FBI detained a Russian programmer named Dmitry Sklyarov. At a gathering of hackers, he gave a presentation exposing the weaknesses in the copy protection system used by Adobe for their ebooks. Right here I have an electronic book, and this is how you load Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment into it. The program developed by Sklyarov allowed for both copying and printing the book. Sklyarov was the first to be accused of the crime of the 21st century that was violating digital copyright law, and he was looking at up to 25 years in prison. The only other country to have such laws was Belarus, and they were seen as an infringement of their freedom by all computer experts, who stood up for Dmitry Sklyarov, demanding his release. Adobe was disgraced and forced to drop all charges. Sklyarov was first released on his own recognizance in North California, and later cleared of personal guilt, with only his employer Elcomsoft continuing to be under investigation. Russian programmers were gaining respect all around the world, with a hacker from our parts spearheading the international intellectual forefront.
Hi, everybody.
Andrei Loshak reporting from California. Sklyarov is spending his detention in the small town of Cupertino in the middle of Silicon Valley. After he was bailed, he was taken under guardianship, which is something that can only be entrusted to folks with a very good reputation and ideal credit history. The government trusts the Osokin family. They're part of the upper middle class that America takes such pride in. This is par for the course for programmers who've been living here for over 5 years. The Osokins are taking Dmitry to visit another Russian computer expert household, also located in Cupertino, but uphill relative to their house. And the view from up there is lovely. Silicon Valley, a programmer's dream. This is where progress is born, and where a third of the people share a common trade. Sklyarov is something of a poster boy, as they say around here. He's not overly fond of his role, but what can he do if fate willed him to be a hero of the time? Starting in 2001, Bulgaria was once again living under a Tsar, their very own former Tsar. The former monarch Simeon Saxe-Coburg-Gotha won the parliamentary election, with his movement securing 43% of all votes, and became the head of the cabinet. Having lost faith in both wings, left and right, the Bulgarians entrusted their fate to their father, the Tsar. His Majesty, the Prime Minister, proposed an emergency 800-day economic program that he promised would aid in Bulgaria's proper development. Simeon, the son of Tsar Boris III, was on the throne from age 6 to 9. He never renounced his title, and during the time Bulgaria was a socialist country, he was living in Spain. He became a successful businessman, and he was almost like a relative to some of the European royal families. Bulgaria was a parliamentary republic where the prime minister had more authority than the president. Simeon appeared to be a noble monarch who truly cared about the good of his people, and having lived through the typical post-socialist corruption scandals, the Bulgarians were inclined to believe that the head of the royal cabinet was incorruptible. Ladies and gentlemen, I accept this offer with trepidation and my innate feeling of responsibility. The most powerful group of people in Moscow were from St. Petersburg. That included President Putin, who put his own townsmen into most positions of authority. Here's a surefire ticket to power. It's a degree from the Order of Lenin and Order of the Red Banner bearing Budanov Leningrad State University, just like the one Putin has. And for the first time since the capital was moved, they were preparing a state house in Putin's hometown. The Constantine Palace, a Kremlin near St. P. Rumor had it that the capital might even be moved back. The St. Petersburg public figures were referred to as the Northern Alliance, the joke of the season. Hello, I'm calling from St. Petersburg. The response? Why did you have to start with the threats? The top government ranks were being stacked with folks from the president's hometown. Boris Gryzlov was head of the MVD, Sergei Ivanov was the defense minister, Alexei Miller ran Gazprom, Sergei Mironov was the Federation Council speaker. The family, the team that carried over from Yeltsin, was being displaced from the Kremlin, the cabinet, and parliament by St. Petersburg natives. Let's go over the various types. You had classmates who went to college with Putin, such as Viktor Cherkesov. Then you had Putin's former colleagues from the KGB, Sergei Ivanov, Nikolai Patrushev, Georgy Poltavchenko. Then there were colleagues from the administration of St. P, Alexei Kudrin, Dmitry Kozak, Herman Gref, Sergei Mironov, Boris Gryzlov, Andrei Ilarionov. They were just from the same town. Previously nominated close associates, Anatoly Chubais, Sergei Stepashin, and finally VIPs who didn't seem to have any ties to Putin, such as Valentina Matvienko and Gennady Seleznyov. The best way to rise within the vertical of power was making that trip from St. Petersburg to Moscow. They used to say on television that the field responded to the farmer's care with a rich harvest. 2001 indeed saw a rich bread harvest, with a 50% increase over the previous year at 92 million tons, and the domestic market only demanding 70. Wheat prices dropped by 30%, and for the first time since NEP years, the country had a surplus of grain. To prevent the grain market from collapsing, the government allocated 2 billion rubles to purchasing excess grain to put into the National Reserve. After decades of importing it, an attempt was made to export 3.5 million tons of grain, which didn't work out because of the Novorossiysk port's limited capacity. Now, this all coincided with the adoption of new land law. Those advocating for private land ownership were insisting that if Russian fields had a landlord, he'd never grow anything that you couldn't sell. In 2001, a new global, as in worldwide, movement was gaining momentum: anti-globalism. These were mostly young people from prosperous countries who were protesting against international inequality and humankind's unification by transnational corporations. At first, anti-globalists were being ignored, but then they got out of hand. In 2001, there was a European Union summit in Gothenburg and a meeting of the Group of 8 in Genoa. And if the police used to fire rubber bullets, during the 2001 summits, for the first time, they had to use live ammunition. In Gothenburg, the police clashed with the anti-globalists until the first blood was shed. In Genoa, the 8 lead globalist sharks were put on cruise ships in a closed port. Train stations were shut down. The airport was only accepting summit-related planes. Meanwhile, in the city center, they were welding steel grating to windows. Nevertheless, the 100,000 protesters who broke every store window in Genoa got what they wanted. The Group of 8 added the anti-globalists' demands to their agenda. But with the first victory came the first victim. A 23-year-old anti-globalist from Italy named Carlo Giuliani was killed during a clash with the police. He became an icon to the movement. During the December Euro summit in Brussels, the police barricades were being approached by folks wearing jackets that said, "Shoot me, I am also Carlo Giuliani." By the end of the year, every progressive person on earth was aware of the anti-globalist ideology, as well as their motto: "We will not let the world turn into one big consumer America." Before, people were guessing whether 2000 or 2001 was the first year of the new third millennium. But now it's obvious that 2001 is when the clock started ticking. Stark warnings, unprecedented opportunities, lessons from the past, tantalizing possibilities, and this is only the beginning. Farewell.